Welcome to Dilemma, a podcast from This Is 42. This is episode number 3, and I am your host, Jay Shapiro, along with your co-host, Mr. Coleman Hughes.
How you doing, Jay?
I'm doing well this week. This week's dilemma is called Do I Smell Donuts? And it is being read in a Michael Caine as Alfred from Batman voice for no reason at all. Enjoy.
In 2012, Dunkin Donuts piloted a new form of advertising on public buses in South Korea. The idea was called Flavor Radio. When the bus was about to pass a Dunkin Donuts shop on the road, an advertisement for the chain was played over the speakers, and a small spritzer installed in the seats of the buses sprayed a pleasing aroma of Dunkin Donuts coffee into the atmosphere for riders to inhale. According to the campaign, when the devices were installed, the aromatizers were spritzing the fumes of coffee into the faces of more than 350,000 commuters while on their daily ride to work. The coffee company saw a 16% spike in visitors at shops and a 29% increase in sales in coffee orders during the campaign. If you were the mayor of a city and this advertising proposal crossed your desk, would you approve or deny the request?
Yeah, so there you go. Flavor Radio, Dunkin Donuts.
That is insane.
Yeah, welcome to our world. First gut reactions.
First gut reaction is that it reminds me of those studies that find when you put people in rooms that smell like garbage, they become more homophobic and more socially conservative. And I'm thinking, how can we leverage that to make the world less homophobic?
So you want to use it already. Use it for good.
I want to use it for good, yeah.
Yeah. For me, like there's something that just feels invasive about it because of smell. I don't know, you like picture it going into your body.
It's involuntary. You can't defend yourself from a smell at all.
Yeah.
Somehow I do have the intuition that it's more invasive than a visual ad. Because, I don't know, at minimum, I can kind of look away. I can stop paying attention. You kind of can't not pay attention to a smell. It is more invasive in that sense.
It feels more invasive. Maybe that
it's
breaks
like
down.
Particles going in you. That's what smelling is. But I guess it's no different than light going in your eyes.
Photons hitting your eyes are doing
this.
But is this immoral to allow this?
From my perspective, I think many people would see this and think, this is exactly the problem with capitalism. But the way I see it, it's actually the opposite, because it's one company, Dunkin Donuts, that is just one part of a market for coffee shops getting privileged access to this public space, to buses that other coffee shops aren't getting. And therefore, isn't it kind of a distortion of the market to give them this? It's giving them an unfair advantage over their competitors.
Yeah.
Which is hindering the process of the market.
So I'll introduce our featured responder this week is Dave Pizarro, who's a moral psychologist and researcher at Cornell University. And he's done the exact sort of studies that you are mentioning about garbage. They actually do like fart spray into the lab and then do just like donation games or whatever, just basic stuff. And so he studies disgust on that level and how it influences our choices. And then the opposite, I think he does like, the smell of cookies. By the way, we have a scented candle on the table right here. I don't know if you've noticed.
Are you trying to brainwash me into agreeing with you?
It's peppermint. There's a whole line on it. Peppermint. I can just read it. I'm going to give someone some free advertising here. Cool peppermint with a hint of vanilla can warm your heart. Imagine the pleasure of a candy cane and a cup of hot cocoa.
Wow.
Yeah, so that's been happening the whole time. Maybe you've been influenced.
I'm very turned on
by the candy cane and I'm drinking coffee also, by the way. It's not Dunkin Donuts though.
One way to go really postmodern on this whole thought experiment would be to say, well, we're kind of comparing the smell of Dunkin Donuts to quote unquote neutral air. But what if that whole paradigm is flawed? What if there's no such thing as neutral air, and the way a city tends to smell has kind of psychological effects embedded in it?
A public bus in Seoul, Korea probably doesn't smell great they're doing a service to the people there. That's the pitch for Dunkin' Donuts. They're improving the air there. You're probably right. Do you think just like smelly cities, people are just making shittier decisions? They're like just more racism and like less generosity in smelly cities because we're probably true, I guess. I mean, the studies would point that way.
When I hear about things like that, like I feel like the classic ones are like a woman wears red and you're more attracted to her or whatever. And one way of looking at that is the redness is impinging on what is otherwise your neutral, rational self. But then if something as commonplace as the color red can affect my cognition in ways that I would view as irrational or departure from neutrality, there's like in this room, there are like 20 different colors. There's like many different factors that could be influencing me all the time. And does that maybe make these results in a way less astounding? Or, I don't know. It's kind of a postmodern take on it. And I tend to dislike those kind of takes, but I could definitely see taking that perspective to something like this.
Yeah. So as always, you haven't heard this interview with Dave. I, of course, conducted it, so I know what's coming. We get into some free will stuff, of course, and authenticity and full disclosure. My first job in New York was with an ad agency. So I've been on the side of this. I never did anything quite like this. But
my mother worked in advertisement at M&M Mars for a very long time, and she was in some big magazine as like one of the top 100 advertisers, and ended up leaving the industry because she was so disgusted with what it was about. Really? Yeah, that's a story for another time. But
no, it might be a story for this time.
That's true.
Because we're gonna. I think Dave and I both sort of challenge ourselves with that with this one. So thank you, David Pizarro, for being on Dilemma.
Thank you for having me, Jay.
I've been fascinated with this ethical notion of the limits of advertising. Are there moral limits to it? Should there be moral limits to it? Where do you even start to stab at this one?
Here is, to me, one of the reasons that this is even an issue. So advertising has been around since as long as products and capitalism has been around. And the whole goal is to convince people who would otherwise not buy your product to buy your product. By any means necessary has sort of been the way that people have gone about doing it. So what's different now? Like what is it that has brought this into sort of more public focus and more, why is this now an ethical dilemma? And I think that the reason is we can finally measure how effective this stuff is. And I have to admit, I'm also partly interested in this because I have worked with a behavioral economics consulting group, essentially in a for-profit business, to try to use psychology to help companies, in many cases, sell products. So I've had to give this quite a bit of thought, because if it's unethical, of course, I don't want to be doing it. But it strikes me that sometimes we would be talking to people in this consulting group, and we would be talking to actual people in marketing departments, and they'd say, well, everything you're saying sounds good, and perhaps it's with the word manipulation that we use in psychology and science in general. The word manipulation meaning simply the experimental group. Right. They hear it as, well, it sounds like you're really just trying to manipulate people, and that doesn't sound right. That sounds like a PR nightmare to them. And my thought is always, what have you been trying to do this whole time? Right? Yeah. Like, you've been trying to sell me whatever, soda in the movie theater by manipulating me. Is it merely the existence of a control group, or is it just like that you're picturing a bunch of like people in lab coats running experiments on everybody? Really, isn't the goal of advertising to be as successful as possible?
Let's start sort of at the top, because, you as a psychologist, it's your job to sort of understand how the mind works and why people might really be doing what they're doing, whether they're aware of it or not. And I'm really interested because I don't know a lot. It seems like smelling something is just so... it crosses some barrier of being powerful. Like when I've brought this one up to friends, they all sort of just like shiver at it, but then they immediately do the calculus of like, wait, how is this different than seeing a really good ad on TV just with my eyes, right? It's still just a sensory input, but there's something about smelling something. Is that, where do we get that intuition from? Is that psychologically sound of like, we smell something and it triggers something, really deep.
Yeah. No, that's a good question. And I think that there is some truth to it. So this is a radical oversimplification, because I have colleagues who actually study smell in the olfactory bulb and all of the neuroscience behind it. So I'm going to butcher it, but it's a quicker route. Right. Like smell really hits you in a way that requires very little cognitive processing. So, for me, for instance, the smell of Play-Doh just transports me back to childhood like nothing else. I don't have to consciously formulate memories and dwell on them in order to feel nostalgia. It is literally that smell that transports me. Many people have had the experience of smelling the perfume or cologne of somebody they used to date when they're walking across the street, and that really just instills a bunch of emotions in you. And I think that's one of the reasons why this particular case, as you say, is powerful, because it seems like one of the ethical principles we want is for people to have some sort of agency over their decisions. And if you are removing something that is critical to agency, then maybe now you're borderline unethical. And I think that's one of the central questions. Is the use of smell in an advertising campaign removing agency, or at least is it a method that has less agency than just, hey, buy coffee?
Yeah. To come up with a moral test here seems really difficult, because there's something about smell that intuitively feels invasive, because I'm picturing it going into my physical body. But this ad campaign also was 2012. The advance is just 7 years later now, with all kinds of tracking. What's lingering around the borders of this moral dilemma is data collection and the Facebook stuff and all that. If I have access to your OkCupid and Pornhub tracking and everything else you do online, and
I use incognito mode, Jay. I don't know what you're talking about.
They got to change the name of that mode to just okay, we know what you're doing mode. But it just given all of the data, and then throw in facial recognition technology and all of that, is it any different if you just get a super targeted ad? That's what's lingering around this one. Is there a test that we can draw that feels, I don't know, sturdy enough to outlast the march of this stuff?
Right. Well, what we can do is ask people what they think of as ethical and non-ethical forms of advertising. And here's where the legal scholar Cass Sunstein and others have done some work on this. And you find what you might expect. People are much more likely to agree with these kinds of what they refer to as nudges. These kinds of nudges when it's for something that's good versus for something that's bad. So if what you're wanting to do is get people to brush their teeth, making toothpaste taste fresh and minty seems like a really good thing to do. If you're trying to get people to smoke Juuls, making it fresh and minty seems like a bad thing to do, right? So there, it's not about how much agency and how much manipulation is going on, is whether or not the manipulation is in the service of something that we think is good or something that we think is bad.
Yeah.
Of course, you get into problems right away, because as I've discussed many times with some of my colleagues who used to do this sort of priming research, if you ask liberals, is it okay to use this manipulation to get more people to vote Democrat? They're like, oh yeah, of course. Now what if Republicans use it to get people to vote more Republican? No, that's evil.
Yeah.
Right. So it's not really driven by the subliminal or the non-agentic right. It's really just driven by what do I want as the outcome.
Because I like coffee.
I love coffee.
But I don't like Dunkin Donuts coffee, so I'm super offended by the ad campaign. But if this was I don't know, Stumptown Roasters, I'd be like, yeah, this is great.
Right. Well, and if you don't like Dunkin Donuts coffee, maybe the smell would actually put you off. I don't know if they actually used their own Dunkin Donuts smell.
That's true. They built these little air fresheners. I don't know if you saw the video.
Yeah, I did see the video. I saw the video that you sent me. And this is a trick that real estate agents say have been using for a long time, right? This baked cookies in the house of that you're trying to sell. And if it works, it works. There are a whole bunch of examples of other manipulations that work. It's taking advantage of the brain's quirks. So I have a friend who did a study showing that when you're buying a car, that the way in which you order the options. So these were studies done in Europe where you basically go to the car dealer and you have to select every option from engine size to the color of the interior trim. A whole bunch of decisions have to be made. Usually the size of the engine is the first decision that people are asked to make, and it's obviously the most expensive decision that they have to make. If you put that decision at the end after they've made a ton of decisions and you default the engine to the bigger one, people are more likely to pay thousands of dollars more. Now, of course, the car dealerships love this. Have you been manipulated into spending thousands of dollars more? Kind of, yeah. Right. So I can see why people would be genuinely upset if they found out after they bought the car that this is what had happened. But I can't shake the feeling that this is not mind control, right? This is still something in which you can say, you know what, I shouldn't, I'm trying to avoid caffeine. I shouldn't have coffee. Or you know what, I'm on a budget. So maybe I'm a little bit too optimistic about the human will, or maybe I'm too maybe I think too much about what we ought to be doing when we make these sorts of decisions. But as somebody who's studied these effects on the mind, they work for some people, they don't work for others. It's not as if somebody's putting a magic Harry Potter spell on you and making you buy anything.
So a lot there, and keep in mind for the listeners as well that Dave is a psychologist and more focused on trying to understand where these intuitions come from and how they're manipulated and how aware we are. You as a philosopher and moral philosopher may be hearing sort of different questions that I promise I'll push him on later. But he laid out sort of a lot of the groundwork there, and then says there's this line that he used there that I really like, the critical to agency, and we're certainly going to come back to that, but how important that notion is at all to a moral framework.
Yeah. Well, speaking of agency, I felt like I almost lacked some there because both you and Dave predicted two of my reactions to the T. It was uncanny. One was you predicted the sense that smell is invasive, and then immediately realizing that light is the same thing.
Everyone has that. It seems everyone I bring it up to has that same wait.
That just makes me feel like a human robot. Like where is my individuality or agency to begin with? But also literally as I was writing down the observation of smelling an ex-girlfriend's shampoo, as I began writing that down, Dave said it.
What's the smell? We don't have to out her if she's listening.
I don't remember what it was, but I know when I smell it, and it brings me back to sophomore year.
I was going to ask if you had anything like that. His was Play-Doh. Well, that brings him back to childhood.
Right.
That maybe that's the thing in the intuition for me is our inability to even know it before it happens feels really powerful with smell. I can't actually predict the smell that will bring me back to my third grade birthday party right now at all. But I might run into something that I'm like, holy shit, that's the thing. And I can't predict it at all. But if there, and I'm hinting at it here with the data stuff, if there was a third party who knew that about me and could press that button when I'm not aware of it, that seems, as he mentions, critical to agency, that removes, upon the further inspection, free will tends to fall apart, but this delusion of it is totally removed in the way that I don't know. I don't know how important it is to immorality. If I walk outside right now and some evil scientist has that button and presses something and I'm transported back to my third birthday party, that's pretty fucking powerful stuff.
You make a good point, which is the asymmetric information makes it even more disturbing. So if someone knew the shampoo that my ex-girlfriend used, I don't even know what it was, but I know when I smell it, and they knew that. Her current
boyfriend knows it.
Right, exactly. And say I was going out on a date with someone and they somehow got that intel and used this and it triggered something, that would feel, obviously I wouldn't know I was being manipulated, and somehow that makes it worse. If I knew, maybe I could have more agency in the situation. Still, though, I do kind of share Dave's sense that it's still up to me to make the choice in that case. And The more I think of it, it seems compelling to me to make the kind of postmodern move to say that there's actually no neutral reality is manipulative. It's extremely manipulative even before the corporate execs and the advertising agencies get to it. It's manipulative from the start. And what they're doing is just manipulating it to their own ends.
Yeah.
But it's not clear to me that that is better or worse per se. I guess it's kind of a case by case basis.
Yeah. I guess I'll jump back into it because I push him here on this like central question on this limit of the effectiveness of advertising. And if there's a limit, and if we can find it, I guess that's the whole point of this exercise in this particular dilemma is, have we crossed it? Why does this Dunkin Donuts campaign cross it? Presumably it's out there somewhere. I find a limit eventually with him, but where we draw it, I think is you and I might draw it in different places. I don't know.
Yeah.
Or Dave.
Have you seen what's the name of the Netflix magician, the big British magician, where he manipulates
He's
people?
great. Is it Darren Brown?
Darren Brown.
Yeah, he's fantastic.
So like that stuff is clearly over the limit.
Yeah.
Getting someone to push another human being off of a balcony with all of these subtle psychological cues and priming. That is clear. I think you could say it's a spectrum, but there's still going to be a bright line somewhere.
So I've posed this to some pretty hard libertarians before, this general question of just, is there a point where advertising is too effective? And this is to play the moral philosophy game in some sort of utilitarian framework of if I'm convinced that generally an Enlightenment liberal society produces the best outcome and this constant balance between at least the delusion of free choice versus manipulation, just generally innovation happens best in that environment, defining innovation as sort of morally beautifully as possible there. The best ideas win, the best products win morally and scientifically, et cetera, most of the time compared to other things. Well, that system will break down if one company who makes let's say you and I both make air conditioners and your company makes a shitty air conditioner that's like shitty for the environment, breaks after 2 days, and I make this great air conditioner and I'm this little mom and pop shop who can only afford $5 in advertising, and I put up a flyer at the local cafe, and you're this multi-billion-dollar company that can hire the ad agency that did this one. They're called Shield Worldwide. And they do this brilliant ad campaign and use everyone's data and convince everyone this is the greatest air conditioner of all time. And your product wins and my product goes away. Objectively, from some consequentialist utilitarian framework, did the system break down there morally, ethically, all of that? And so usually what libertarians tell me is they can see my argument there, but they just sort of do almost maybe what you were making noises of there, of like, well, this stuff's actually just not that effective. They all claim it's way more effective. It's actually it's harder than you think. I just sort of have to shrug and listen to that argument, I guess. But I also think there must be a point where that becomes untrue. Maybe the Dunkin' Donuts thing is not quite there yet, but it's not hard to imagine that gets there. Or maybe I'm totally off base. Maybe this fear is unwarranted.
Right. I think there's something a little bit, I don't know who you talk to, and I certainly don't want to cast aspersions on anybody's character, but I think there is a general flavor of a disingenuous argument where you retreat and say it's not that effective anyway. Mm-hmm. If you're making a moral argument, then if it works and you're manipulating people, then it doesn't really matter how many people you successfully manipulate. I don't buy that so long as we keep them ineffective, then it's not wrong. Because that's silly that nobody's happy in that scenario. The whole point is to maximize sales. I think there are a few things going on. One is the example that you gave seems to contain some level of deception. Mm-hmm. So if I'm saying this is a wonderful product and it's snake oil, that deception, I think, is unethical, and there should be standards governing whether or not you are allowed to make certain claims about your product. And it certainly happens all the time. Advertisers find shady ways around it, right? So they can make claims that aren't technically lies, but they are deceptive. I think that is unethical, and I'm for regulation in that sense, because if you just left it to the market, the best liar would win every time, right? Maybe over time they would lose because your air conditioner would break down, but the consumer doesn't know that in the short term. So whether or not you're deceptive is one thing, whether or not you are selling something that might be harmful, or you're promoting some sort of, say you're a government trying to use public service ads in order to promote something that's harmful for the individual, is only beneficial to the government. I think those are principles that we have to keep in mind. So we shouldn't be allowed to sell rampantly just products that are just harmful.
Yeah.
The manipulation question in and of itself, I think it's morally sort of neutral. I mean, so in this sense, it is vague enough because there are various things that you might call manipulation that might have different moral standing. So suppose that what you're doing is simply providing information. Suppose I actually do want coffee. I love my morning coffee. I skipped it. I'm on that bus in South Korea and I hear that ad and I smell the coffee and I'm like, sweet, I do want coffee. And I've just heard and been given a very visceral reminder that the next stop will contain a coffee shop. That it's certainly more effective, and you that alone could account for the numbers going up. And if that's what's going on, then I don't think that that's unethical at all, right? It's people aren't being hypnotized, rather you're providing information. This is one of the principles Sunstein points to. Things that are providing information, nudges that are informative, that are getting you to process information that you might not otherwise have processed, those seem to be not unethical in and of themselves.
Yeah. So maybe I'm fishing for it, but I'm trying to extract this general moral maybe question about is there a moral imperative to retain we could talk about free will if you want, but the delusion or illusion or actuality of feeling like you have agency over these things? Like if this ad worked in some other crazy way where a robot just like picked you up and carried you to Dunkin Donuts, you feel like this is totally against my will. But if this thing gets into your brain and you smell it and you're there, is it really, is it philosophically different, the picture here, other than sort of just like, this thing carrying you there? What seems to be different in that one case is it feels like you had agency to say no. The libertarian free will that upon further inspection tends to break down still feels real. And is there a moral imperative to retain that? Even if this ad was for the most purely objectively moral thing to do and it nudged 100% of the people to do more of it, is it still a moral violation because it would remove a nugget of a delusion of agency? How important is that to the notion of morality?
Right. Setting aside, obviously, free will debates and just assuming that there is a difference between coercion, right, as you say, like lifting you up and carrying you somewhere and telling you to buy a coffee or something, versus some form of persuasion that might be effective where you think that you made the choice, but perhaps you had less agency than you did. There are plenty of things that are okay and are coerced. So I have to wear my seatbelt, right?
Yeah.
And maybe the hardest core of libertarians would say this is bullshit. You're forcing me to wear a helmet or a seatbelt is bullshit. But most people think that, no, you know what? You should force people. You should actually coerce them by literally fining them large sums of money and upon repeat offense, perhaps even tossing them into jail for a few days in order to do that. I don't think coercion in and of itself is bad. At least most people wouldn't have the intuition that it's bad because there are some things that we want to coerce people to do. And so there they have absolutely no sense that they could do otherwise. I mean, they could, but there would be consequences. Retaining that illusion that you had control over something else. I mean, I think that this is just our everyday lives. So for instance, Jay, you and I have certain core values that we espouse, that we think that are important, that we tell others are important, that we want other people to have. Those probably came from our parents and our culture. And we probably never chose those. We had no agency over those. I don't think that threatens our endorsement of those beliefs. I think that just pointing out what the causes are is okay. So I think what it boils down to in ads like this really is that the intuition that a corporation is trying to get me to buy something. Mm-hmm. And I think this is the most offensive part. If what they were trying to do is get you to care more about your neighbor or to donate to charity, right? I would love to see whether or not a charitable appeal Well, people do this all the time, actually. You know, for a while, the New York Times used to run an ad showing children who needed cleft palate surgery.
Yeah.
Right. And so these were very visceral, emotional ads, and it probably worked to increase donations. That, to me, is the same kind of manipulation as the smell of coffee being sprayed in a bus. So I can't help but think that the intuition really is driven by this notion of an evil corporation trying to manipulate me rather than somebody else trying to manipulate me to do something good, like a charity or a government. So I do think that it's not really, manipulation isn't really what's at issue. And I think people are perfectly willing to accept that, you know, go back into the 50s when soap operas were made to sell you soap, right? Yeah. That this was a form of manipulation that didn't seem to bother people. In this case, I think we are just a little freaked out by technology and technological advances and understanding of the mind and the effectiveness with which we can manipulate this. I think what's more going on is this heuristic of the evil scientist trying to get me to buy my coffee. Whereas,
because he's evil.
Because he's
that was
evil
the word that you put in. But exactly, if it was a nice scientist, you're okay.
If it's a nice scientist who's trying to promote health behavior, and they are showing me pictures of diseased lungs in order to scare me into not smoking, then, well, you know, that's just what you got to do to get kids to not smoke, right?
Before I push on that one a little bit, because I think there's a whole other conversation about, I want to get your thoughts about the notion of objective morality versus purely subjective. But before I do that, I want to, well, you went there, but I think we go there in all of these actually. But this is a public bus and public transportation. Does that affect the variable at all, that these people can quote unquote, you know, not escape, especially with the smell thing? A lot of people that I bring this up to, they say, well, yeah, an ad might be really flashy, but I can turn my face away, but I can't turn away from a smell. It goes a step too far. A public bus that you can't turn away from, you got no choice but to smell this damn coffee on that bus. Does that affect it at all?
I mean, not to me, right? I mean, I believe those people, you know, might actually believe that, but I think that that there is an interesting question there about whether public transportation should be selling ads. But it really isn't the case that I'm going to close my eyes and avoid all of the ads that I see on buses or on the subway. I don't. I see them. Like I definitely see them, and I'm not going around trying to close my eyes. And I could plug my nose to the Dunkin Donuts coffee. I think that one of the things that maybe people confuse is they think of this as some sort of mind control because of the smell. Yeah. And maybe even would use the word unconscious manipulation. But the truth is, you know that you're smelling coffee. It came right after an explicit Dunkin Donuts ad. And if you watch the video, they are Dunkin Donuts labeled little canisters of smell that are up on the bus. I don't know that if the smell of coffee under those conditions is so strong that you find yourself buying Dunkin Donuts when you yourself didn't want to buy coffee at Dunkin Donuts, then yes, maybe you have a case here. But I don't see any substantive difference between a very appealing ad for hot, melty chocolate chip cookies where, you know, with a high resolution photo of you know, chocolate chips being, you know, cookie being broken in half and the chocolate chips melting. That's pretty powerful stuff. I'm not personally offended by the fact that it's a pretty powerful image that makes me want a cookie. And I think people are being a little unreasonable when they complain about this. This is just new. It's a novel way of advertising, and it maybe feels unfair, but I don't think it's any different than what people have been doing for.
Your description of the cookie sounded good. You should throw a Pepperidge Farm or something, some sponsor in there.
Well, you know what I was going to say, Jay, is that if this is unethical, our experiments are extraordinarily unethical because we have done experiments where we bake cookies in the lab just for the smell, right? And we've also used foul odors in the lab as well to show those. Now, those, when we completely don't tell people what's going on and what we think, how we think they're going to be affected, I think there ought to be, again, regulations in how honest advertisers are.
So, do you want cookies now?
I actually don't like sweet things at all. Yeah, I often get criticized for this, but it just doesn't work with my palate. Now, thinking back on it, though, the very first coffee I ever had in life was Dunkin Donuts. I was 18 years old.
You nostalgic for it now? Like
No,
it's
it
an
was-
extra level.
I felt the rush of the caffeine, and I was, it's a drug that I
Your first
now
coffee
love.
was at 18?
Yeah. Is that late or early?
I think it's late. I don't know.
Yeah.
I was one of those kids drinking coffee with my mom.
No,
Like at
no.
the kitchen table.
No, I couldn't do that.
Yeah. So in that section, we're getting into more of obviously the free will thing. We could do it. And maybe we ought to. But this continuing to push Dave there on this notion of authenticity. And he seems to, this is a variable that's interesting that I'm about to push on. I'm curious what your thoughts sort of about knowing you're being advertised to. Does that make this okay?
Well, I think advertising works whether or not you know you're being advertised to. I mean, just the fact that profit-motivated corporations sink millions into advertisements is, in my mind, knockdown proof that it works whether or not you think it's working.
Yeah.
And you might cherry pick the exceptions to that rule, people with exceptional minds or who are exceptionally resistant, but the vast majority of us are not that person, even if we think we are. Like, I'm someone who I see an ad and I think that's BS. I'm not going to buy. But even just seeing something that has a brand that is respected versus a shop I've never heard of before, I know that that's influencing the toothpaste I buy. Why do I buy Crest toothpaste? Or why do the fact that I know the word Crest is proof that their advertising has done something for them, because I'm going to go for that over a random toothpaste that I've never heard of. So no, I don't think it makes a difference whether you know you're being advertised to.
I wonder. To me, it seems like the line that we're trying to find in this whole episode, it's almost this constant battle that advertisers, I'm not sure if that's true. It seems the most effective advertising is the ones where like your friend is using it, or someone just gives you a recommendation, which doesn't feel like an ad, if
That's just information. But I guess an ad
if
is
you trace it back far enough, they were advertised to at some point. Like at some point, the ad worked. Like whatever shirt you're wearing, there's a logo on it, which I won't mention. But like if we trace that back, eventually that meme is in the environment somehow, and now you're wearing it. Like you wearing this is subconsciously affecting me in some way, probably more effectively than a direct ad for that company. But I'm not sure.
I think that's right.
Because I don't know, quote unquote. You're not. Are you an advertisement for me right now? Like, is this ethical that you're wearing this? You're nudging me to buy this.
Right. Well, I guess I guess you could think of it in terms of giving information to potential consumers.
Yeah.
So you seeing me wear a shirt with this logo, it signals to you, you like me, you know me, I'm the type of person who would buy this.
Assuming a lot there.
If I'm wearing this shirt, then if I'm still wearing it, it's probably served me well. I probably haven't gotten made fun of. You may not be thinking explicitly in these terms, but your mind is probably at some level computing all these things. To a lesser extent, every advertisement is a kind of signal that, if I'm watching TNT, if this person is advertising on such a major network, they're a successful company. So that right off the bat signals something about their product that isn't signaled by products that can't afford on the average. In a condition of not having much information about that market, it's giving me some information. And, I think one of the observations I had was that you can overstate the effectiveness of ads and you can understate the effectiveness of ads. Clearly ads are effective, or else they wouldn't be spending money on them. But how effective are they? If ads were all that mattered, for example, then you wouldn't expect the quality of products to rise over time, and yet they virtually always do, right? Technology is a clear example. The laptops and the phones now are much better than they were 10 years ago. It's not just because Apple has good branding. It's they're both inputs into the system.
But yeah, and doesn't this go to? I tried to make a point that I don't know how eloquently or not, but about sort of this utilitarian framework. It sounds like you're sort of making an argument that I like here, that if ads were too effective, we would actually stagnate innovation and progress, because as I love this line that he said, what the
best liars
would win.
Right. And we know that the best liars don't tend to win. But we
but if the liars had smell on was Dunkin Donuts lying? That's whatever. Coffee is subjective, which we could talk about too. But given the amount of manipulation techniques, can the better liars win? And then we're just gonna,
I think what probably happens in practice is, what's really the difference between Pepsi and Coke? Or better example is, what are the difference between different kinds of water? I don't know if you've seen that hilarious.
Fiji comes from an island.
Exactly. You've seen the video of Fiji's CEO.
No. Oh no.
Oh, they really nailed it. Okay, so they asked Fiji. They lined up a bunch of different kinds of water and asked Fiji's CEO to see if he could tell the difference between Fiji water and like tap water.
Yeah.
And he couldn't do it.
Of course.
He could not do it. So water is a special case because it's so similar. All of it's so similar, but Pepsi and Coke, they both do the job. People have a preference. I feel like when you get to that point, when you have a good product that most humans enjoy or many humans enjoy, then the better liar can really win in a sense. But it's still, if you have a poor quality product, no amount of advertising is really gonna make you the world leader in that sphere of the market. So quality and advertising matter. And maybe it might be the case that advertising matters more as the quality differences get smaller between you and your competitors. I'm not sure. I'm thinking out loud. But.
Yeah. I push on it a little later in the interview with this notion of, I think Dave mentioned it there, like this ad, if you are trying to avoid caffeine or sugar or something, can it make you want a coffee? I think that's like the worry from a moral philosophy standpoint. That's the worry, is like hijacking people's pre-stated desires and overriding them because you sprayed this smell in their face and they're weak to resist it. I push on that a little bit later. Yeah, it's interesting. And again, Dave, as a psychologist, I think is more interested in describing the picture here than making really, elaborate philosophy claims, which we could try to do. But this notion of separating, him saying that there's just no problem with manipulation generally, I worry about. I was trying to do a thing there of, even if your product is great, and you've manipulated 100% of the people to use it, or super moral in some whatever world that is there still some sort of, I don't know, moral violation there? It's an open question, I guess. I'm curious your thoughts on it.
I guess my tendency is to think that life, like I said before, life is manipulative to begin with. Yeah. It's not as if there's a condition of zero manipulation, a condition of neutrality from which we are departing when we're spraying the Dunkin Donuts thing. I mean, in this room right now, there's a big American flag. Mm-hmm. What is that doing to me that I don't know? I'm almost sure if you typed in American flag into Google Scholar and looked up some paper where the control group, the experimental group got an American flag and changed something about their patriotism.
Yeah.
I'm sure that's potentially doing something to me. What is the piano doing? I play piano, have for a long time. That has associations with my childhood. There's a piano in the room. There's guitars in this room. So what is all of that? It's not as if this condition is neutral, and if Dunkin Donuts smell were sprayed in here, we would suddenly be departing from a condition of neutrality.
Yeah.
Another interesting thing, the philosopher Roger Scruton, he has this video where he talks about, I think, what he calls the tyranny of pop music, and how everywhere in society now, if you're in a mall or in a shop, there's just music playing. Is that influencing us all the time? Yeah. We'd probably be tempted to see that as neutral, quote unquote, but is that kind of subliminally telling me to consume? I don't know. It's hard to say.
Yeah. I guess I'll keep playing it here because I definitely push him harder on this notion. You could hear him trying to wiggle out of the objective morality conversation.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
I don't think I was successful in pinning him down, actually, but we'll see. So in your studies, when people know, like, okay, this is what we're trying to do to you, doesn't it, I might be getting this wrong, doesn't it still work? People think it doesn't. Like, I've granted them this delusion, like, yeah, I'm manipulating you. And they're like, oh, cool, now I can resist it. But they actually are just as susceptible.
It totally depends on what kind of manipulation we're using, but it often is the case, say, with a disgust manipulation that we've used, and this is what a lot of disgust researchers have kind of just discovered in the process of doing these studies, is that if it is too obvious that you are using a disgust manipulation. So the reason we use odors, and it's not super strong odors, but mildly bad odors that could be, you kind of forget about them as you're doing the study. If we just give people gross pictures and then have them, say, take a survey, it doesn't work. People know that they were disgusted by those pictures, so that emotional state isn't influencing their subsequent right? If I ask you, hey, look at this picture of a mutilated arm. Now, what do you think about two gay men getting married?
Right.
They're going to be like, well, I see what you're trying to do here or whatever. Like, this is not going to work on me. But if it's just a kind of a nasty odor that's permeating in the lab, you don't know what's going on, you're just answering a set of questionnaires, it works better that way. So in fact, a lot of times the test for whether something is an unconscious influence or not, like if you really want to figure out whether it was unconscious in the true sense that people had no awareness of it, making people aware of it would make it go away. That's evidence that it was unconscious in the first place.
To walk through the experiment, it's just like a simple, you do like a donation game and spray like fart smell into the lab. It's as simple as that sometimes, right?
It's as simple as that. So in our case, we did just a scale known as the feeling thermometer. We say on a scale from 0 to 100, very cold to very warm. How do you feel about the following social groups? The elderly, immigrants, gay men, black people, whatever, and so what we found in that experiment is that the smell influenced people's attitudes toward gay men.
Okay. So the novelty of smell and all these new technologies, can you foresee a border in your moral analysis? You seem to be like taking the line that this is new, we'll get used to it, it's not that effective. It sounds like, maybe I'm getting it wrong, but it sounds like you're okay in principle with this ad campaign. You just think the evil corporation is the problem, which we'll talk about next. But before I move to the who's behind it, just the method itself, do you see stuff that's coming down the pipeline that can cross a threshold for you where it's actually it is mind control effectively? Is that coming? Like deep fakes and whatever else I could throw at you?
I don't think so. I mean, ever since, the 50s, where people have been trying to flash subliminal images of whatever, Coke in movie theaters, I don't, psychology is so messy. The ability to just move people just a little bit on anything is pretty difficult. It's hard for me to envision, other than direct neural implants, anything that could modify behavior in a way that bypassed agency so entirely and so completely. Now, it doesn't mean that I don't think some of this stuff should be regulated. I mean, I remember hearing people debate at a conference the U.S.'s policy on rebates. Says, something says like it's $500, but $400 with a mail-in rebate. People are much more likely to buy it, and it's some really low number of people turn it.
Is it that low?
ever? It's really low. I mean, it's really low.
I think I've done two in my life. I should probably get an award for it. Actually, they shouldn't send you the rebate. Just send you like a Medal of Honor.
Seriously, it's like doing your taxes sometimes. I don't know why it's so difficult.
I know,
so I remember hearing a behavioral economist and an economist argue with each other, one saying this is completely manipulative, and the other one saying it's all spelled out for people. If you do not turn this in, you will not get the money. And I think, perhaps contrary to many of my colleagues, I think that as long as there's honesty, then agency is still there. Like nobody's putting a gun to your head and making you do any of this. And let me just clarify too about the effectiveness part. I think that for the moral question, it shouldn't matter at all whether it's effective, right? So if it gets 10% more people to buy coffee or 50% more to buy coffee, if it's the moral question that I think we're discussing, really it would be about how is it getting you to buy coffee? Is it bypassing your agency, or is it just introducing you to information or a potential influence that would be the same as any other advertiser? I think there's a deeply interesting question as to whether any advertising should be displayed in some context. So nowadays, I don't know, Jay, if you have a family, if you have kids.
No.
I haven't watched TV in a long time, and my daughter is of the age where she rarely ever had to watch it. Every once in a while, when I show her just a TV show on TV and a bunch of ads come on, I'm like, oh my God, look at how they're trying to sell this shit to kids.
Yeah.
It's incredibly, and of course, right after they see the commercial, they want it. And I grew up in an era where that was the case. So like, I want Optimus Prime.
Yeah.
Like, I need Optimus Prime. If we're going to be talking unethical, I think then at that stage, it's already unethical.
Yeah.
Right? I don't think there's anything new about pumping a smell accompanied with an ad.
Okay. I think it's a little more effective. Maybe I just feel that way. Or there's something coming down the pipeline that would be. Yeah, I think I'm getting this one from Paul Bloom. It was some kind of experiment with desire implementation, and some doctor in a lab somewhere, I think it was mice or something, had figured out some neuron manipulation where he could make them do things that they normally wouldn't want to do, like mice like run through rings of fire or jump off high places or whatever. And he was presenting this research, and someone in the audience is like, this is the most unethical thing I've ever heard. Like, this is torture. And he stopped and responded with this sort of a brilliant counter of like, man, these are the most, these are the happiest mice on earth. They have this like flinching desire to do this thing, and then they get to do it. Like they get to enact their desires all the time. And the fact that in this case, maybe this is your evil scientist argument, but wouldn't that also, be the case that if we're the guinea pigs here, like you're saying, if I don't care where my desires really come from, if I want to think about it and get into the free will, bottomless pit, and I don't want to do that of being like, I have this desire and I want the thing, and I get the coffee. Like, okay, I want Dunkin' Donuts more than anything in the world. Oh, cool, there's a Dunkin' Donuts right here.
Right.
I'm the happiest mouse on earth at that point. And so is it actually immoral just to, if you could, I know like you're resistant to me doing this, but if I could, well, you brought up brain implants or something. Let's just say I could do it. Let's say a future of, brain implants and neuro robots all running through our body or whatever, and that gets sold to advertising for whatever high dollar they're willing to pay. If Dunkin' Donuts could just put a desire in my brain right now, and then the coffee appears,
Right. So say they could inculcate desire completely fresh,
totally,
just in you.
They press a button and it's in you. And
I mean, at that point, I do think there's a substantive difference that you are bypassing the normal route to agency. So we're influenced by our peers, by our parents, by our environment, by advertisements. We're bombarded by a set of influences that we take into our brains, and we process that information, and sometimes it leads us to action, sometimes it doesn't. As far as I understand it, this is a way in which we are normally manipulated anyway. You walk by the food court in the mall, you probably are more likely to buy something to eat than you would have before. I mean, Cinnabon, for God's sakes. I don't think I ever want a Cinnabon until I'm walking by a Cinnabon.
Yeah.
And so you might say, well, they should keep tighter airtight doors.
Turn the fans around the other way.
Because people are smelling it and they're wanting, you're inculcating a desire in them. Mm-hmm. And I think, I guess part of my argument is in the normal course of human events, these are the sorts of influences that affect us. And these are ones that upon reflection don't seem to bypass our agency in other ways. So in the Cinnabon case, I smell it and I'm like, I shouldn't, I don't feel like I've been coerced or manipulated into wanting Cinnabon. I feel like, this is the byproduct of smelling something that has fat and sugar in it, and that's something that my body really wants. Yeah. Right. In the case of coffee, I'm addicted to caffeine. Right. I know it. I smell coffee. I want it. And I guess part of what bothers me sometimes is that advertisers who would do this in a haphazard fashion, try to find any way to try to get you to buy coffee, might stumble upon a method of, keeping coffee canisters open as soon as you walk into a coffee shop or something, and in a way to get you to smell it and want to buy coffee. There is something, I think, about people's intuitions about that experimenters have figured out once and for all that this is effective, that they use a control condition and they have data on it, that makes it seem more unethical. And Facebook is a good example of this, right? The whole fiasco surrounding, right, there's been a number of them, but one a few years ago was, hey, did you know that Facebook is manipulating your feed in order to make you feel an emotion? I mean, my first thought was, when is this not the case? It's advertisers are manipulating your emotions all the time, right? There's TV shows are manipulating your emotions. There's nothing wrong in principle with manipulating your emotions. I think that the intuition really is coming from, who is Facebook and what are they trying to do?
Okay. I'll let you wiggle out of that one then, and I'll go to the objection from reality, because I think there's got to be a line where maybe I'm wrong. If this notion of authenticity and I'll call it an illusion. I know upon further inspection it falls apart, but the illusion of an authentic desire and an authentic emotion, I'm with you. Like, it's of course. We are that might be a totally incoherent concept, but for a moral structure, it might be one of those illusions that you have to keep in. I mean, with what you said, I agree with you. It's never not the case. When are you never? Yeah. This is the ultimate question of, is advertising period just unethical? And my only argument for it is that what I was referencing earlier, a utilitarian consequential of, like, okay, of course there's dark corners of this, but ultimately this is producing the best moral innovation and progress, et cetera. The Enlightenment sort of notion of liberty at its base relies on these dark corners to not, to be self-correcting in some way, that the system will zap enough of them.
I think that, a couple of things. One, I think it's pretty clear that advertising is not servicing any overall utilitarian. I think there's plenty of evidence that going back to cigarette advertisers, for instance, that these are serving the local interests of companies that may or may not be giving you a good product. And while, like, I do believe that something like a free market leads to innovation in some grand scheme, there is a lot of local inefficiency there, and a lot of people might be made to suffer. So, but I think that's sort of a separate issue. I don't think you can, maybe when it comes to public policy, where really the explicit goal of a government might or ought to be to serve the interests of the people, maybe there you can formulate an argument that it's good no matter what. But I want to get at your even reluctance to embrace the notion of authenticity as a genuine construct. I think that even if you deny the libertarian free will, like the uncaused cause that some people seem to naively believe, the way the human mind works, I think that you don't need that in order to at least distinguish between various forms of influence. So even if everything sort of from the Big Bang on is causing us to have this conversation, there's a way in which having a gun held to my head that makes me, perform an action is very different from me deciding to perform an action, even if that decision itself came from something like the way my parents raised me and the TV show I watched this morning. Right. And I don't think it's just that it's better at the illusion of freedom. I think it's a different kind of mechanism that we are far more comfortable with because it emanates from us internally. I think advertising is kind of the same. I think that we see what's going on and we know we're being influenced. People are attempting to influence us. And again, so long as there is no blatant deception, I think this is just one of the many influences we encounter in our daily lives that we either let influence us or we don't. And this is just true of most things that we do in our daily life. Should I stay at home on this snow day, even though I probably could shovel my driveway and go meet with my students? I think I'm going to stay at home.
Yeah.
Why? Some combination of genetics and environment that made me lazy.
Yeah.
But I'm all for it. I'm embracing this.
Yeah. So I want to stay on what you're going through. Does it matter if, I think you brought up like eating a donut or whatever. What if everybody has diabetes that's walking by you and you're spraying the donut, smell at them, and they happen to be for, whatever their authentic or non-authentic desire resistance is, they're pretty weak to the smell of donuts, and they reliably eat a damn donut when they smell one, and you keep spraying it at them. Does it change the variables of, I don't know, the numbers in Seoul, but what if everybody there had like a major sugar and donut problem?
Right.
Does that change it of who is the target of these advertisements?
I do think so. But I think that's getting away from the nature of this particular ad campaign, but rather the content of the ads and the harm that the products might bring.
It's just to maybe sharpen that. I guess I'm asking about the moral luck of having a strong will to resist this kind of advertising. We know that not everybody has the same resistance, grit, whatever words are going around in psychology departments these days of the marshmallow test or whatever.
Right.
We know that those variables, again, for whatever reason, are not evenly distributed perfectly. So by allowing this kind of advertisement, are you ensuring that a certain percentage of people who are just morally unlucky are going to get diabetes because they're going to be subjected to this, and that's just a harm that we're willing to take on board?
Right. Well, that's a great question. And I think that the messiness of life is that I have to ask the question, what would the alternative be? Applied ethics is always sloppier than the pure ethics that we like to talk about. And I think that, one of the instances that's very similar to what you brought up is the presence of like Coca-Cola vending machines in elementary school campuses or junior highs or whatever. After a while, people got pretty upset that Coke was putting in these machines and that these kids are a vulnerable market. And I think that's a genuine consideration, right? So is this a vulnerable market, right? A lot of things that are targeted to the elderly. Yeah. You might say, well, we know for a fact that in a large proportion of elderly people, their ability to process information has slowed down, and it makes them more susceptible to scams. Regulation in those cases, I think, is a good thing. I think that we should look out for these kinds of groups that are especially vulnerable. Now, when I was in grad school, there was a professor, I believe he's still there, Kelly Brownell, who argued that there ought to be a fat tax, right? So he said, we are in a toxic environment where high sugar, high fat foods are so readily available. Our bodies did not evolve for this. Let's charge more money for fatty foods in an attempt to encourage people to not eat those. Now, that to me is more coercive than the smell of coffee. Like that is actually causing people to move from the ability to buy something to the lack of an ability to buy something for the sake of health. Now, I think a utilitarian calculus might really matter, right? It's just, we made that decision for cigarettes. Yeah. Should we make it for these kinds of foods? There you're on a case-by-case basis. I still think that this is a different question than the one of how much does an ad influence you? How much is it bypassing your agency? I think at this point, really what we're talking about is let's get the most influential thing to help people become better people or inform them. And let's not use that super influential method in order to get them to buy products. And I don't know that, I don't know.
So getting into the notion of who you're advertising to, changing the moral calculus.
It really does change my intuitions. And it reminded me of a story my mother always used to tell me. My mother grew up in the South Bronx, and she grew up very poor, family of 7 kids, immigrants from Puerto Rico, and they used to have, when they couldn't afford orange juice, they used to have sugar water, which is just sugar in water. And often for breakfast, they would just have donuts because they were cheap. And just like terrible, terrible nutrition, right? Not by choice, but really by necessity. And eventually my mom was the first in her family to go to college. She ends up working in advertising, just kind of stumbles into it. And she goes through the ranks. She's working at M&M Mars, and they're selling, I don't know what it was, Twix or Hershey's, one of these bars. And she's in a meeting with the execs, and they say something like, we're over-indexing is the word we're over-indexing among low-income blacks and Hispanics, and said this in a celebratory tone of voice, right? Like we're over-indexing in that we're selling more than we expected to sell, or we're selling more in relative to their size of the population. And she felt that there was a kind of Orwellian tone to the word over-indexing there, because what you're saying is poor blacks and Hispanics are buying candy bars in lieu of real nutrition, more than we expected, and our only attitude towards this is to celebrate because it means profit. That's the kind of story that makes, I think, typical people hate corporate America.
Yeah.
And it's the kind of thing that made my mom leave that world and then become a Marxist.
Well, that's when Dave challenged me with like, what's the alternative? Yeah. Is it Marxism? I mean, I want to talk about that maybe after like the last bit when he goes, is like futurescaping the alternatives? Because I think like why I think generally moral dilemmas and these kind of conversations are so important is because this line that, I will say all the time is that any good moral dilemma, the impetus should be to try to design a way to never be in it or to design your way out of it. And that challenge, what's the alternative? Because, I'm admitting to him here and I'm admitting to you here that I don't know the alternative. And we're about to get into more of this. We're talking about vulnerable markets. I'm going to push a little harder just to maybe make a case that more of us are more vulnerable than we tend to think. And whatever that, but I'm willing to, in sort of again, in this utilitarian calculus, that if this system produces the most moral outcome and I can't come up with a better alternative that's available now, and I don't know the roadmap to get to it, then I'm willing to take on some harm. You push on anything far enough, it becomes a trolley problem. There will be some people bulldozed by ads that do get diabetes in this calculus. And that's an unethical data point. But if enough data points of flourishing happen, I'm just like forced to accept it. But even one unethical data point ought to be too much for us. But if we can't come up with an alternative that the math works out in a better way, and I want to talk about that a bit more later, but that's what really, sticks. I mean, frankly, this is where I think I start winning the interview.
I could already kind of tell with the diabetes question. Yeah. It was really pointed the way you asked it. I agree that the whole cost benefit style of thinking leads you to some very icky conclusions sometimes, because if you really take it seriously, you have to consider that even the best things have costs. Yeah. And even the worst things have benefits. And it's a matter of doing the math, I say in quotes, because what is the math really? The math in these cases, it's not clean. Yeah. It's not clean. I think one principle that might be useful, and this is a reflection on the story I just told and your thoughts about targeted demographics, is that there's a big difference between a person who has lots of knowledge and a person who doesn't. Yeah. There's a big difference. I mean, we implicitly recognize this in the fact that we don't want certain things advertised to kids, because I don't think a 10-year-old can handle alcohol. I don't think a 10-year-old can make responsible choices. I'm almost 23. If anyone told me, I know that drinking is bad. I know it's doing only neutral to bad things for me, but given that knowledge, I would not want anyone else to make the decisions for me as to how I use alcohol in my life, because it also has benefits socially. And I want to be the one in the driver's seat with regard to how I turn the dial on alcohol in my life. And I wouldn't want to see that to anyone, because nobody knows better than me how much, which is not to say I'll make the perfect decision, but it's what's the alternative. I don't think you would be better at deciding how and when I should use alcohol, right?
Yeah.
So I think there's a bright line between people who know better and who don't.
Who know better? Yeah, I just don't know how bright the line is.
Well, I suppose it's not. It's actually not bright.
I mean,
it's
I'm trying to muddy it here, because if it's
it's not as if on my 21st birthday I suddenly became.
Yeah.
Right. So
enjoying that line makes sense, but this notion of evenly distributed, I brought up this notion of moral luck, of just, you're lucky that you can resist it, I guess. But what if you weren't? By no fault of your own, we get into the free will thing. Like, this is just as sort of a side note. I hear often in philosophy conversations that libertarian free will, and then they quickly are like, it has nothing to do with the political philosophy. I actually think it totally does. In a moral calculus, I'm like, it totally does. Like, the libertarian free will, if it were true, the moral calculus totally changes in the conversation we're having. Immediately, if you were an alcoholic or you struggled with alcohol, and upon further inspection, libertarian free will breaks down, and we can, by no cosmic fault of your own, that's the situation you're in. Well, advertisement A over here, works better to you than the Coleman, Hughes in the universe here who isn't an alcoholic. And so the libertarianism morally, I think, hinges on the notion of libertarian free will. But of course, we're saying, like, we will take a harm on board here. Some people will just become alcoholics because this is the best we can do. I'd love to talk about ways to design our way out of it at the end. If I remember correctly, Dave actually does bring up alcohol and cigarettes in the next bit. So we'll just let that play out, and then we'll finish up with our thing.
Cool.
I'm imagining some possible world where you would have some, let's go with the brain implant future, where you have something in there helping you regulate kind of your desires versus your ability to choose. It would be lovely to be able to inculcate and protect a certain portion of the population who might be more susceptible. And you're finding this line. I don't know what the number is, if you could do this in a lab, of like, this is the appropriate line of effectiveness that we will allow to the general population. And because this particular person is really susceptible, we're going to, limit them. They won't smell it. This implant in their brain will make them see a different ad. It seems like there's got to be, maybe we're pointing to some needle of like, this is the appropriate moral kind of pinpoint if we could somehow standardize this amongst the population. You're lucky. You sound like you can walk by a Cinnabon. Well, I don't know. You didn't answer how many times you go to it, but maybe if you're okay with like 5% of the time, well, some people just aren't. Some people are like, struggling with their diets. One of my favorite, but also terrible things, you see it on Twitter all the time. People are struggling with this like Twitter addiction. You'll see someone do the tweet that says, I hate this thing. How do I get suspended? And it's a funny joke, obviously, because the joke, and a lot of times they go viral. The joke is, of course, the libertarian response is, well, you could just sign out, dude. You don't have to be on it. But the joke is, of course, of like, I can't just suspend me from this damn thing that I can't stop scrolling through. But I have a ton of sympathy for that. I think we all get the joke and retweet it on some level because we sympathize with you don't have, I'm really jealous of the person who could be like, oh, I'm off Twitter for a week. Cool. Put down my phone.
Yeah. You know what, Jay? You raised something interesting, which is one potential solution. For a while, people have talked about pre-commitment devices, right? So the economists Thomas Schelling and John Elster and Paul Bloom's written about this, with the idea here being, I know I'm going to lose control, so what I'm going to do is try to find a creative way to not get myself in that situation. And so there has been a market has emerged for software that actually blocks you from whatever app you choose, right? So there are apps that will say, and now I believe it's built into iOS and Apple products, that will say, you know what, I only want to be on Twitter 30 minutes a day. I can program that in, and it's going to be really annoying for me to have to turn it off. And here's a technological solution to avoiding these difficulties. And so maybe the market can be correcting in that sense where you can take a pill and increase your grit and not be manipulated by the coffee, or whatever the case may be. You learn to wear headphones. I did want to ask you this. Do you feel, and I find people have different intuitions about this. So one of the ways in which marketing and advertising might be most effective is by targeting, right? So I know you, Jay, I know the kinds of things you like. So I specifically give you ads for things you might like. Instagram has gotten pretty good at doing this for me. It knows that I like things like cool luggage, and I'm constantly seeing like really cool ads, and I click on them. It's working. Now, the only other option would be the days when they didn't know what I wanted, and I might get ads for whatever eyeshadow. Yeah. And the truth is, I have my brand of eyeshadow, and I've had it for years, and I don't want to change.
I've been scanning your room for luggage before you said the eyeshadow. Now I'm looking for that.
Oh yeah, you can see I actually have a briefcase there that I bought from an Instagram.
Oh, there you go.
And do you think that that targeting is unethical, even if it is more effective? I bet you it's more effective even than the smell of coffee.
My intuition is probably similar to yours. I've been playing some devil's advocate. I mean, I remember the early days of just geo-tracking of maybe 10 years ago, this conversation was kind of hot of like, oh man, my phone knows where I am.
Right. And Minority Report style.
Yeah, exactly. And films like that were coming out, and you would do the worry, and some of that has come to pass, but it was also like, well, if I want pizza and I type pizza into my phone, I don't want to show me the pizza place in Minneapolis. I want it to show me the one next to me. So on a base level, you're like, well, of course, like, I'm generally open to these things, but I am sympathetic to the people who might not be so lucky and go into massive debt from clicking on those ads on Instagram or whatever's happening.
Right. Or, well, I mean, games that have in-game purchases. Yeah. How many cases have there been of, little kids getting their, or even adults, right?
Yeah. My intuitions are, another person that we're going to, in our season 1 is Matthew Crawford. This is actually, I should mention, I've discovered this case from a Matthew Crawford book, The World Beyond Your Head. Fantastic. He's doing a different dilemma. In that book, he writes about sort of slot machine psychology. And this has been popular with like phones and using this kind of slot machine addictive behavior, clicking on this or whatever. And he tells in sort of a journalistic part of it of going to these slot machine casinos all night and talking to people who are literally there wearing diapers because they're not going to get up. And it's like really awful.
Depressing.
And the most depressing lines are the ones who say like, I just want to lose all my money so I could go home. They know they're going to zero out. They know they're totally, they've no resistance to just putting it in. When they have $1 left in their pocket, they will put it in the machine, and they just want to go home, and they're exhausted, and they just want to lose all their damn money so they could go to sleep. So we read those cases and we feel a lot of sympathy. At least I do. I think we all do. And then we think, man, okay, maybe that's just the cost of this kind of libertarian society that we have. Of there's going to be some people who get addicted. There's just a percentage of that. This why I love this dilemma so much, and what I think it pushes that intuition of is maybe that's more of us than we think, and maybe it's finding us in different things. I don't have a gambling problem. I'm not attracted to the slot machine. Okay, great. I'm lucky. Do I spend way too much time on Twitter? Absolutely. Do I struggle to eat well? Absolutely. It's like, I think we all have to admit, and you as a psychologist have to admit, we're all susceptible to these things, even if we feel like we're not. Maybe the smell of coffee is not so much. It's like, it's kind of a joke, right? Like when we were kids walking through malls, old women would spray perfume in your face when you were walking by, and it's like, okay, I could just walk away from that. But
that's right. That's a very good example.
I mean, that one happened. It just seems so silly.
Absolutely.
Because this woman with like way too much makeup was spraying something at you. But I imagine there was probably 1% of the women who couldn't walk through Sears without spending $90 on some crappy perfume. That percent just might be a little bit higher than we think. I don't know. I'm worried about the influence of these and maybe future technologies. Again, this case is from 2012. I can't imagine what they're coming up with now.
I mean, we're optimizing, and we're optimizing to a degree where we probably are encouraging behaviors that aren't healthy. With things like Twitter, which I totally feel you on, it's kind of unclear how harmful it is to us at this point, right? Maybe down the line we'll realize that I don't know, playing these iOS games that are addictive or being on Twitter too long really, really are harmful, and we shouldn't have let it get this far. But I think that your other point is just right, which is that we live in a world where we're bombarded by the ability. We have access to things that we never would have had access to even 10, 15, 20 years ago, let alone whatever, when our brains were evolving. And that poses a real challenge. It poses a challenge to us as individuals. It poses a challenge to an enlightened society that's trying to develop laws that will benefit its the people it's supposed to protect, at least.
Yeah.
And we're at the cusp. We don't, right now it's like, Apple might actually be the ones who are trying to figure out whether a game is appropriate or not and put age limits on that. But we do have slot machines, and we still sell cigarettes and alcohol, and we know those are just, there's not even a calculus that has to be made, right? Like the death toll from alcohol alone is ridiculous. The death toll from cigarettes, gambling addiction, all of that stuff we're doing a shitty job of dealing with it as a modern society. And then as more and more things crop up, that'll, now I can spend fucking days on Reddit, right? Because there's some subreddit that never would have existed when I was a kid.
It's this, I guess, the impossibility of this. We have access to so much more, and then it has access to us. It's like this does seem to be moving just in one direction. You rewind the clock, if we were we wouldn't be having this conversation like this 500 years ago, but like the earliest forms of advertising, like the locksmith puts up a sign and paints it really well. It's like, it's a very low level manipulation if you were living in that world of the branding of locksmith A versus locksmith B or blacksmith. I don't even know, it's moving in just this one direction where it's the rise of sort of the self-help book or that world seems to be about building your resistance to falling into traps that are set for you everywhere. So I guess I have a lot of sympathy for this, and the conversations with my libertarian friends are becoming challenging. And you were mentioning it there sort of at the end with Apple. My biggest concern with the libertarian conversations is their habit of being very worried about government coercion and government control, which is great and historically the biggest sort of enemy of the libertarian philosophy. If it's just about control and coercion generally, as you mentioned, we're talking Mark Zuckerberg and Apple and these kind of, who are not, what can you do? And if there's a libertarian philosophy that is about whatever authentic liberty is, or we've been trying to put our finger on it this whole conversation, it's not always the government, and sometimes it's literally the opposite, where we're asking for the government to protect us from the people who are enacting too much coercion. And maybe the libertarian philosophy has just gotten so nostalgic for government control that we're letting the much bigger bad guy just sort of slip through the back door and be like, okay, cool, I'll take control of everybody.
I mean, look, Facebook just turned 15, right? 15.
That's so cute. Did you go to the bar mitzvah? I gave him a little envelope. I know Mark needed the money. And it's had an impact on the world, right? That nobody could have foreseen. And I think that you're right. It's almost cute to be concerned about governments, where governments right now are frantically, like the European Union is frantically trying to figure out what to do about the power that some of these companies are accruing. Yeah. And, maybe the right libertarian response ought to be like, well,
what we were worried about was central control over my autonomy.
Yeah.
And this is closer to central control over my autonomy than has ever been present in a government.
Right. I think so.
And so what do we do about that, right? We can't rely on another company to crop up and put Facebook out of business. So maybe the empowering the government as a means to increase my own autonomy, right, in the face of the actions of these big corporations might be a libertarian 2.0.
Yeah.
Although I doubt they would agree with me.
Yeah, me either, but I'm trying.
I want to end on something optimistic, which is that I think to the extent that that we can educate people about these sorts of things, I think it is a worse kind of evil to push snake oil on ignorant people than it is to try to push snake oil on people who know better. And it may be effective still on people who know better. In many cases, it probably is. But I think that making these influences clear is a minimal ethical requirement for us, maybe as behavioral scientists, maybe as government, maybe as journalists. And at least there you would give people the first step of realizing that something is going wrong and trying to do something about it. Maybe that's technology. That will come from technology too. Who knows?
Yeah, that sounded more like a plug for your book, but
they say if I had a book, I would be plugging the shit out of it. Yeah.
But to educate ourselves that we're being manipulated as much as possible is something that I've done. Every time I pick up my phone, you sort of just picture on the other side a multi-billion-dollar corporation that is, scheming to try to get me to keep clicking on something.
It's incredible.
Yeah, and just that mental image helps me sort of build up some sort of resistance.
That's funny. We should everybody's phone background should be a picture of Mark Zuckerberg smiling,
just like Mr. Burns style, like with his fingers going or something. Yeah, no, that's great. This was super, super fun. We didn't get to sort of. I'll save, I guess. Do you believe in objective morality?
An objective moral truth.
Yeah, Coleman and I could bat it around at the round table of because when you mention evil scientists versus good scientists, that
right,
it sort of passes the moral philosophy buck. But this was great. Super, super fun to get into. Thanks, man.
Very fun. Thank you so much, Jay.
So I outed myself as a Marxist, clearly. Me and your mom were on our way.
My mom, yeah.
So there you go. That was the whole interview with Dave Pizarro. I don't know where you're at the moment.
That was great. I think we ended up converging on the importance of the difference between people who can and can't decide for themselves, or maybe put differently, people who know better and people who don't. It does feel different. And this may sound condescending, and perhaps it is properly condescending. I think of my grandmother, had a third grade education, could barely speak English, really couldn't speak English. So there is, it seems to me, a moral difference between advertising something to her and advertising something to her grandson, who has the benefit of higher education, familiarity with the culture that I'm in. It just does feel different.
Yeah.
And I think it is different.
Yeah. I struggle with it, trying to figure out how effective, if it's true that this stuff is more and more effective. I don't know what the lab will decide for us. Is there a line where we're just willing to accept a certain level of effectiveness of advertising, and should that change based on a product? So let's, I don't know how many times you walk by a Cinnabon and how many times you give in to the temptation, but let's say it's like 2% of the time you give in, and you don't love Cinnabon, but you're willing to accept 2% of the time they'll hook you in and you'll enjoy that Cinnabon or whatever. And then let's say you want to eat more broccoli or something, and you want the broccoli advertising to be 50% effective. This is almost like, he's talking about these preset, like you set your desires somewhere, And then in some crazy futuristic world, you have a brain implant where you
Google Glass.
Yeah. But Coleman Hughes version of here's the effectiveness level that we'll allow. And then someone like your grandmother, it's we're not going to let her see this ad, but we live in this world. We all see the same ad, and it's not evenly distributed. This luck and the effectiveness. I'm uncomfortable morally saying with the slot machine things of all right, why isn't there a slot machine here in New York? I don't know the laws here. I imagine video poker is not legal here. It is in Pennsylvania where I grew up.
Yeah.
That was
I think that's right.
thing. Yeah. In fact, in Matthew's book where this comes from, he talks about Ed Rendell and the slot machine kind of analysis in Pennsylvania and getting that in. And he was challenged of you're going to create addicts. And his sort of take is well, those people are just, they were addicts to begin with, and they're just going to be unlucky here, I guess. It's just a harm that we're willing to take on. He did a utilitarian calculus. He would always answer it by saying, oh, look at all the tax revenue we're going to get from this. We're going to open schools, et cetera, et cetera. You could always play that utilitarian game. It becomes exhausting of allowing these harms on there, but I'm just uncomfortable with it. But I don't know the solution with it other than some world where it is tailored to this person is morally unlucky and I know they will give into the temptation of this video poker. So I don't know. I don't know how to dial that down for them and dial that up for someone else and find the perfect, if I'm the moral agency of the city and I'm video poker can only be 3% effective, but your broccoli.
I guess you're locating the lever to pull in terms of the effectiveness of the advertisement. I feel like a more fruitful path would be to locate the lever to pull with who is allowed to be advertised to begin with, and then let the advertisers be as compelling as they're going to be.
But would you change it based on the product? I mean, this is the other question that we did.
I think change it based on the product. I mean, I don't want, like I said, I don't want cigarettes advertised to kids. I don't want many things advertised to kids.
Yeah.
But I mean, I guess you run into practical problems because we live in one society kind of, and if something's on a billboard, then it's advertised to whoever can see a billboard, which is everyone.
For now. Like you said, Google Glass, maybe you see a different ad than I see, because that's where we're headed, right? I mean, Dave was resistant to it, but we're headed to a world of that I could tweak exactly what will be effective for you. Whatever you find attractive, let's say it's a woman on a billboard advertising a new product or whatever, and you see it in that world and it looks different to you. We already get that on our phones. This sounds crazy and futuristic, but this is already happening on our phones, where probably most of the advertising is hitting us, and especially kids.
When you say that, though, that makes me think, well, it's not so bad, because at least as a matter of lived experience, I'm not experiencing the downsides of advertising in my personal life in a deep way. At least I don't think I am. I remember getting ads for Christian therapy about a year ago on Facebook. Yeah. I'm neither in therapy nor a Christian.
The algorithms aren't very good yet.
Right. So, well, there's that. And then, I thought about this when I walk through a grocery store and there's someone there selling free samples of something absolutely delicious. So you're getting something much more than the Dunkin Donut. Not only are you getting the smell of this product, literally the product is right there in your face for free with bags of it to be purchased right behind you. And I think the vast majority of people see absolutely no problem with that. That said, what makes me very resistant, what makes me really skeptical of the ethics of the Dunkin Donuts situation is one thing you raised with Dave, and I don't remember exactly what he said, but why does Dunkin Donuts get privileged access to that public space? I think it's okay when companies are competing against each other in the same medium. Coke and Pepsi, they can advertise in the same places. They're both advertising on TV, competing with each other. If one, for some reason, if it becomes known that Coke is much worse for your health, that will come out through journalism and it will affect their sales. And, there's a free market principle that probably works out well most of the time, not always. But with Dunkin Donuts on a bus, once you have an aroma on a bus, it's not as if you can have a competing aroma. The mom and pop shop down the street can't also put in their aroma into the bus air. It seems different.
Yeah.
And in that sense, it seems different from a Subway ad too, because you can have many ads on a Subway. All advertisers they can bid for those spaces. It's kind of fair, so to speak, in a way that aromas on a bus don't seem to be.
Yeah. No, that's a good point. Yeah, this notion, he used the word, I think, bombarded twice, because I feel like I tried to raise this notion of like the self-help or even mindfulness or whatever. Like this, it seems like so much of this is the attention economy, I guess is the word for what we're experiencing with this. It's just like you picture just corporations just trying to grab this. Like you can almost picture people, like your mind is this open space that is up for grabs now. And people are just trying to grab it at all times. It makes you nostalgic for that world where it was just the blacksmith with his fancy painted ad, and you could sort of just, I wonder if anyone worried about that at all, of like, this is too effective. His ad is just too darn good.
No, yeah, that is something I've experienced, and it worries me that I'm no longer as worried about it as I used to be. I remember maybe I don't know, in the past few years, I've had the experience that I think probably everyone has, which is I open my laptop, my fingers, as if they have minds of their own, type in the letters FAC or type
Usually
in
just need the F at this
TW,
point.
yeah, TW. Like I do not ever remember having the conscious thought, I really want to go on Facebook for the next 8 minutes. The fingers just do what they do, and they do it a dozen times a day. And, I haven't been thinking about that as problematic lately, but upon reflection, it is seriously problematic to me. And I have used the self-control app that Dave mentioned to great effect.
Oh, has it been?
Oh, it's
I had
brilliant.
one on called Moment, and then like I turned it off because I lost. I lost to my own self-control.
Well,
it like set this alarm. It started yelling at me like, get off your phone. And I was like, fuck you.
The self-control app is completely coercive. If we're talking about coercion, it prevents you fully. If you put in Facebook for 12 hours,
no workaround.
There is no workaround.
Really?
You can turn the computer off and on. You can delete the self-control app.
Yeah.
It's pointless. You can't get on.
Don't you feel like these are, that sounds great, but don't you feel like that's the admission that this conversation is like, it feels like a temporary fix, right? Like we don't want to have to do that as consumers. I have an ad blocker on my Chrome. And like every website I go to now has like a pop-up that asks me to turn it off with this very like, oh, we rely on our advertisers and our sponsors to bring you good content. So do you mind turning that ad blocker off? And you could ignore it and be like, no, I'm fine. Mm-hmm. Like Hulu does this to me, CNN, all these websites. And it feels like this reminder, like they're going to get me. Like this is like a temporary, like I've escaped the system for now, but they're going to get me. and then, but to Dave's point in this larger question, I guess that we're all avoiding of the, maybe we sound too critical of this whole system here. You can point all of this in a great direction. If there was a moral sort of, I guess Yuval Harari writes about this, talking about techno religions and whatnot. If there was a moral sort of framework behind all of this that I fully trusted to take care of me, this should be amazing, right? It's like if you imagine your refrigerator knows everything that you have in it, and it scans everything that you have. I guess this probably exists already. Everything that you put in there, it scans it. It knows how much you've drank. It's just monitoring your eating activities better than you are yourself. And some new product comes on the market. Let's say it's a soy creamer for your coffee. And you're like, you like your local one, you're finding it or whatever, but it's pretty sure, given your taste buds and big data and self-learning and neural networks and all that there's this new one that you're going to love. This is going to be like your favorite soy creamer of all time. And it just, that advertiser, pays for it, and it just appears, your groceries are delivered for you through some big Amazon corporation.
Oh, like you don't even have to decide.
It decides for you.
You put it on this setting, and
you can call it an ad, like a free sample. Again, like to reference like the absurdity of where this started. It was like magazines used to have that perfume that you would scratch or whatever, like there was a page that you could smell the perfume. It basically be like that.
I remember. Yeah.
Yeah. So like the refrigerator would just order a little carton of this creamer for you, and it would just appear in your fridge. And let's say it was incredible. Like let's say the algorithms are really good, and you're like, that's the best damn creamer I ever had. Thank you.
And if you don't like it, you can just press a button.
If you don't like it, well, it'll
I don't
know.
really see what's wrong with that.
The refrigerator will know because you'll just stop drinking. You don't even need to tell it. It'll just monitor you. That feels creepy on like every level. But
when you're knee deep in that soy creamer, do you really care if it's creepy?
Yeah, and maybe the soy creamer is even like, let's say like you tell your refrigerator, I really want to get healthier. You tell it your New Year's resolution, which like everyone gives up by like January 2nd, but your fridge like figures out a way to really keep you on your diet in this way. Maybe that's a beautiful world.
Like an equivalent of a self-control app for your fridge where it wouldn't allow bad food into it.
Sure. Or
like, and there was no override function.
Yeah.
I mean, I'm a fan of the no override function, but I mean, you said something earlier.
No override just like
it changes everything.
But it admits that we all suck at this.
It admits that we all suck at it, but it also is a tacit admission that I'm making the cost benefit analysis on Twitter and Facebook that they're net goods. Because if I was really saying they're net losses, I would delete them. I absolutely would. What I'm saying is for the next 7 hours, Twitter is going to be a net bad just for the next 7 hours. I have an essay to write by the end of the day. Yeah. That's the context generally in which I would be using this app. But the fact that I can make that calculation implies that I could, in principle, make that calculation for all of Twitter. I could say for the rest of my life, Twitter's more bad than it is good for me. Yeah. And now I'm going to press the button, cancel the account. But the fact that I don't do that and that I only do it for a day at a time suggests that I know, I still know what's best for me when given the option to do the total override.
Yeah.
And I really like that total override. I think that's good. I think you have to counter this stuff with better technology.
And this is also the admission of like short-term thinking versus long-term thinking, right? This is the like, you smell the cinnamon and in that moment it's the sugar and the fat is but you know that thing is bad for your health and going to, make you feel terrible eventually.
Come to think of it, the piece of advice that is anecdotally true and it has been told to me by people and that I follow is you don't shop hungry.
Yeah, right.
Like, isn't that just a kind of another application of the principle that, like I said, reality is manipulative? The grocery store is incredibly manipulative. I've shopped hungry and bought so many things that I want to eat right now, but I don't actually want to eat in my life. So when I shop full, I'm much more rational.
Yeah. So trying to find, I don't know. And I guess the question then is like, are we putting way too much onus on people this is maybe a political question, to do our part to build up all these defenses and have all these hacks rather than just like, fuck off corporations, like give us a fucking break. Or again, the corporations are doing their job. This is when I was trying to bring up this like libertarianism 2.0 is like, who is between you and the corporations? Is it just you and your will and your hacks to try to keep their fingers out of your brain? Or are we asking someone else to do it? So to make this a true moral dilemma, let's just put ourselves in the seat here where, this ad campaign proposal comes across your desk. You have the option to allow it or deny it for Seoul, South Korea on public buses. What's your final verdict?
I'm going to deny it primarily because I think scent is importantly different from visual. Specifically because when you have a scent dispensed in a public space, other scents can't compete. There's a monopoly principle that I think should be obeyed in that context. And not to mention the fact that scent just is more visceral to me in a way. I'm imagining myself on a subway getting a scent ad, and scent is more powerful, I would argue. And so I guess for those two reasons combined, I'm going to deny it if it comes across my desk.
Yeah. I probably deny it as well on the same principle of the effectiveness of it, that it's, maybe I could wait for the data to come in. We'd get Dave Pizarro to do to send me some data. And if it's effective over some, arbitrary number of I don't like the number that they came out with. What was it, like 19% walk-ins or something? Yeah, it crosses a barrier where I just think the advertising is too effective. I don't know. I'm convinced by the bracketing and harnessing of the effectiveness of advertising for a product such as Dunkin Donuts. And yeah, again, tabling sort of the objective moral argument about what the product is. Yeah, I'll say no on that intuition. But yeah, I don't know. So next week, we're going to take on a dilemma called Listen to the Music with the psychologist Nina Strominger from the University of Pennsylvania. It's all about the ethics of listening to a musician after it's revealed that they are not such a great person publicly. So it should be fun.
Looking forward to it.